As our leader mentioned earlier, in principle, we are in agreement with this because, and as Senator Morris Dixon and Cavan Gale had said earlier, every effort must be made to ensure that we create sustainable societies. And part of our sustainable societies is the use of solar instead of fossil. And so to that extent, we absolutely give our support in that quest. But, Mr. President, you will allow me to just go through this bill and make some observations, which I hope will be accepted and will make for a better bill. The first thing, and I think Senator Bunting mentioned, is that this bill deals specifically with what is called the principal place of residence. And it defines principal place of residence on page 4, that is on page 4. But I have a concern, Minister, and I tell you why I have a concern. Whereas I understand that you have to start somewhere, the fact is that if the objective is to create a more eco-friendly society, and if the benefit is a tax credit, then I believe that this ought to be open to businesses as well, particularly small businesses, which are the engine of our society. There are many small businesses which employ 5 or less, well, those are not small, they're micro businesses, which employ 5 or less persons. But their overhead expenses, particularly their energy bill, is such a deterrent that even if they want to increase salaries, they simply can't. Because if you don't have light, then you won't have your business. I, for example, operate a micro business. And I can tell you that my light bill, and my office is open from 8 to 5, Mondays to Friday. And my light bill is sometimes discouraging. My electricity bill is more than my telephone bill. Sometimes my electricity bill is more than I pay my lowest paid staff. And so, Minister, I would love for us to consider opening this initiative to small and micro businesses. And it's something that I think we ought to consider. And not just the principal place of residence. But I get it. And then we look at principal place of residence. I have another concern. Because when we look at the definition of principal place of residence, and I know in other legal matters, we use the term principal place for certain benefits. But for this purpose here, it says, principal place of residence means the dwelling house in which the owner primarily resides and excludes a dwelling house that is primarily unoccupied, occupied by a tenant to the exclusion of the owner, or occupied by any other person in the absence of an owner. I have a problem, and particularly with C, that says occupied by any other person in the absence of the owner. And I say this because we have situations where persons may live somewhere else, but they pay the property tax for that place, they pay the utilities for that place, and their children or their parents who are unable to provide for themselves and who are dependent solely on them live in that place. I can't understand why, Minister, those persons could not benefit as well. Yeah. So I am asking, therefore, that we take a second look at the phrase principal place of residence to include these situations, which happens a lot in Jamaica. I know there are families who actually you know, the mother may live overseas and the children live at home with a caretaker or grandparent, but the mother whose name is on the title does not live there. Is it that she would not be able to benefit? I'm just saying, or she could live in the country and the children go to school in Kingston with someone else, but it is her home. Can she not benefit? I want us to be a little bit more open and practical and in tune with our Jamaican reality, Minister. And I ask you to give some consideration to that. And while looking at the grouping of persons who can benefit, within the National Housing Trust, there is a program that allows for loan for solar panels as well. But what is interesting about this loan, Senator Gale, based on my reading and understanding, is that it is not just applicable to NHT contributors. It is also applicable to institutions, to businesses, and on their website, they outlined the different businesses or the requirements for commercial entities to benefit from this loan. I don't know if it is far-fetched for us to just look and see what NHT does and see how we can learn, we can adapt, and just widen the pool, because at the end of the day, all Jamaicans are going to benefit. Minister, the other point I want to raise is at Clause 2, subsection 2, that's 25F2. And there, it speaks to the maximum that one can benefit, which is $1.2 million. I understand that this is a start. But the last time I checked, Minister, the cost to install solar in a 3-bedroom house is $5 million. And
she said you checked the wrong place.
That's cheap. Well, you know, Minister, you have just, thank you for helping me. And I guess that was cheap. That probably was just my price. But the point I'm making is, in a situation, Minister, where you have two owners, in a situation where you have two owners or three owners, and all of them are paying their taxes, is it that each person can benefit up to 1.2, or is it that only 1.2 can be given to the unit? So it is 1.2 to the property, regardless of how many owners, regardless of how much your income is. Again, I believe that is something that we need to look at. But I think what we also need to look at is, should we pin it solely to PAYE workers? You know, Senator Gale says that this is going to protect the workers. And I agree that it will protect the workers to some extent. But when you have a workforce of over 1 million people and only 70,000 fall above the threshold, meaning that only 70,000 of the 1 million pay PAYE, then the truth, Senator Gale, is that we're not going far enough to benefit our workers. Because you're going to have situations where the farmers in Manchester or the farmers in St. Elizabeth or South St. James who are working but perhaps not paying their taxes, or Northwest St. Anne, yes. And they are working, they're employed, they're self-employed, but they may either A, do not pay income tax, or 2, do not fall above the threshold. They can't benefit. So again, you know, I think that if we're going to create something that is going to revolutionize our economy and really bring into focus this sustainable economy that we seek, then we need to cast the net wide.
That's right.
Because over 600,000 persons within the workforce, Senator Gale, would not be able to benefit. So I'm also recommending that this is, even though they pay GCT, and some of them actually will pay NHG, will pay NIS, but they just fall below the income tax threshold and they simply can't benefit. No fault of theirs. And they'll pay their education tax. So I believe this is something that we can look at. Again, Minister, I want to find out if persons who benefit under the NHG scheme, the NHG loan scheme, whether they can also benefit under this. I'm not sure. It wasn't borne out in your presentation. Perhaps it wasn't considered. I'm not sure. But just for clarification, I do not see why they ought not to. But I'd love to have some clarification as to whether or not they can. On page 3, we're continuing on at clause 2, subsection 4, page 3. It speaks to the requirement for electrical work to be carried out for the installation of the solar system. And first I want a clarification. Is it that the applicant must have installation work carried out contemporaneously, or is it that the applicant is only required to present a certificate from a certified licensed electrical inspector? And the third question is whether the cost for A, installation, which I gather from my investigation can go up to $3 million, or certification, the certificate, which on average is about $200,000, whether that cost is covered in the list of expenses that will be credited. Shall I repeat that question for you? You got it? Okay. So I'd really love to have some clarification on that. And if it is not included, may I suggest, Minister, that this, in fact, all costs associated with meeting the requirements for the credit, that those costs are calculated and the benefit is applied to all costs, not just the actual cost to purchase and install the solar system. Then at G, Minister, and I have a little problem with G, because at G it says that at the time of computation of the tax credit, the property tax in respect of the dwelling house at which the solar system is installed has been paid up to date. Minister, I support and I encourage all Jamaicans to pay taxes. But you and I know that the Jamaica that we live in is not black and white. You and I know that one of the things that define us is generational land, is family land. And you have situations where a person's name may be on a title, or persons may be able to own property through a common law title, but they do not own the entire property, and the property tax, which covers the larger tract of land, is not payable solely by those persons. So for example, let me break it down. I'm living on a 1-acre piece of land, and on the 1-acre parcel of land, I have my house, Senator Morris has her house, and we may have 4 or 5 other family members living on the 1 acre. But the responsibility to pay the property tax is all of ours. And every month I will give my contribution towards the property tax. But for one reason or another, it's never paid in full because some persons simply do not pay. In that situation, Minister, I would love for you to explain to us, how do you see such a person benefiting, or why should that person not benefit because the property tax is not paid, particularly in instances of family land? Because if this is going to be a deterrent, then I'm going to suggest, Minister, that we go back to the drawing board. There are several ways in which we can treat with it. We can bill it into the tax credits. We can deduct it at the end. You know, there are several ways. But the non-payment of property tax should not be a benefit to this greater good that can impact the country. And Minister, as I close, whereas I give my support to this bill, I ask you to consider that, and Senator Gale said there are many lessons that we would have learned from burial. And if never before, and I know this is something that Senator Samuda talks about in terms of solar and building that sustainable economy, that we have to take the country along with us. And in taking the country along with us, our policies and our legislations have to be reflective of our reality. And in that regard, this piece of legislation is not reflective of the true reality. It is not reflective of the housekeeper who doesn't pay income tax. It is not reflective of the domestic worker, the ancillary staff worker, who don't pay income tax because they fall below. Or as Senator Brown said, the wholesale worker. And I said before, it does not reflect the reality of some of our farmers in our rural parishes. Therefore, I would ask that if not today, that in very short order, that some consideration be made for persons who fall below the threshold to ensure that they too can benefit. And you know why it is important, Minister? I'll tell you why it's important. The truth is, people like you and I, we pay our income tax. But people like you and I can't afford solar panel. People like you and I can't afford to pay JPS. The people who really have the challenge in paying JPS and who really need the solar energy are the ones that this bill is not covering. And that is why it is important. So, Minister, I commend those for your consideration, if it pleases you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Frazer.